We often think that jobs during the Middle Ages were quite different than those that exist today, but actually many of them are connected. Some even have the same titles now as they did then. Let's travel back in time and have a look at how you would have fit in during the medieval times. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Carpenter. During the Middle Ages, carpenters were considered to be elite workmen who were highly skilled and used one of the oldest types of building material. As towns began to stabilise and expand in the 10th century, carpentry guilds were established, and a golden age began for woodworkers because they were given expert training. Master carpenters were often retained by royalty, nobles, and the church, as exacting pieces of woodwork were required in castles, estates, and cathedrals. Only the finest of craftsmen would do, because furnishing these buildings was not just done for practical and decorative purposes, but also to demonstrate wealth and status to any visitors. The guilds decided on the rules to be followed by all members in order to encourage fair competition. Those caught violating the rules would be fined, but any member who became ill was financially taken care of. The guilds also supported any widows and orphans of associates who were in economic difficulty, and often paid for the building of churches or schools within their towns. Carpentry apprenticeships were highly sought after, and enrollment could cost families very large sums of money, as it took between 5 to 9 years to become a journeyman. An aptitude for maths was required for the correct use of a compass, square, and ruler. The 12th century Viking Mastermer chest contained some medieval tools thought to have been used by a carpenter, such as an auger, a saw, a gouge, a chisel, and an adzo. Only after proving his technical aptitude with these tools could an apprentice achieve the position of a master and set up his own workshop. It could be argued that many of the implements that were used at the time were quite basic in comparison to those used today, but one only has to look at the fine examples of work on show in the medieval cathedrals and churches around Europe to appreciate the talent of these skilled workers. Master carpenters are still as much in demand today as they were in the Middle Ages, and can earn high wages just as they did then. Architect. Highly in demand during the Middle Ages and paid accordingly, they were needed for their knowledge of construction for the building of the ever-expanding medieval towns. Architectural styles went through transitions throughout Europe during the 1,000 years history of the Middle Ages. The early period saw Romanesque architecture, which was followed by Gothic in the High Medieval era and High Gothic in the later period. War was rife across Europe, and many structures such as towns, buildings, and castles were constructed with this in mind, and primarily as a form of defense. Some architects were executed if a castle or city was conquered. After all, having his defensive structures captured by an enemy was a sign of failure for any architect. But obviously religious buildings remained at the forefront of architecture during the entire Middle Ages. Focus was put on refining the design of the Gothic cathedral. Making them vast enough to reach up towards God and celebrate his strength and greatness was always a top priority. Many famous cathedrals, such as the Notre Dame in Paris and York Minster in the north of England, took centuries to build, meaning that the architect would have died long before their completion, the builders relying on the plans and drawings that they had left behind. Today's planners are more likely to be designing housing estates rather than huge churches, but they will still need to have advanced skills in maths and design, as well as having a highly creative mind. Locksmith. Mentioned in the Old Testament, locksmithing is one of the oldest professions in history. Unlike the metal locks made and used today, very early ones were made from wood and were quite big and clumsy, with pins that could be operated by a wooden key. In the early Middle Ages, simple iron bolt locks were used in Europe and Asia, but dramatically changed in functionality and appearance over the medieval period, as more ornate designs emerged from superior metalworkers. Locksmiths became an important part of castle security, providing locks that defied picking or damage was a highly sought-after skill. Members of the trade were trained in private within their guilds so that the secrets of their techniques would remain protected. They were valued highly within medieval society and earned high wages. Rather than creating an unpickable lock for some dungeon shackles, today's locksmiths are more likely to help someone who has locked themselves out of their home, making them necessary and valued members of our society. Apothecary. In the Middle Ages, if you required medicine, you could either go out and pick your own herbs, go to the nearest monastery which retained a herbalist, or visit the apothecary shop in town. Both of the roles of herbalist and apothecarist were quite similar during the Middle Ages. The herbalist was a role generally taken on by clerics, and the church would usually provide a small plot of land that could be cultivated by the herbalist themselves or by a staff of either their religious brothers or peasants, who might be paid a small wage. Monks would often charge a small donation for their preparations, although they were bound by laws of poverty. However, for those who could afford it, the shop apothecary could charge whatever they liked. As trained physicians were only for the very rich, it was the apothecary that took care of the common folk, and as such, they were highly regarded by the people. They also had their own guilds. Apothecaries dedicated all of their time to the art of healing by using medicinal plants, herbs, and roots. Planted in their own gardens, they would maintain their ingredients, many of which have natural curative properties. Some would need to be combined with other components to reach the desired results. These mixtures of ingredients were known as compounds. Those that consisted of just one item were called simples. A lot of plants needed to go through various processes such as crushing, boiling, or drying to work successfully, making some form of laboratory essential. Some apothecaries also sold spices. Both herbalists and apothecaries spent years studying their craft. Today, pharmacists are also responsible for supplying suitable medicines to their patients. Although they no longer need to pick herbs and roots for the medicine themselves, some do supervise production and help to prepare drugs depending on their role within the industry. Baker. Baking was a common occupation during the Middle Ages, as bread was a staple food at the time. Many bakeries were built outside of the city walls to avoid the risk of fire. Their work was highly regulated. In 1267, King Henry III of England decreed the assize of bread and ale, a law that imposed rules on the weight, price, and quality of goods. Any baker caught underselling was severely punished. This is how the expression "a baker's dozen" came into the English language, which means 13 rather than 12. Bakers began to add an extra loaf into their orders just to make sure that they were selling the correct and lawful amount. During times of famine, bakers were forced to sell their produce at below market price so that the people would not starve. Bakers' guilds existed from as early as 1155 in London. Those that were good enough and fortunate enough were employed by royalty or nobles and had the security of life inside the castle walls, working with the cooks and chefs to prepare rich meals and large feasts. Today's bakers work in many settings, from restaurants to small bakeries, but they still share their difficult working hours with their medieval ancestors, as most still start work in the middle of the night. Barrister. As the Middle Ages progressed, laws became more important and more noticeably defined. Before the 13th century, priests would interpret these laws in the City of London, but in 1234, King Henry III ruled that this was no longer lawful within the city. So in the later medieval age, a separate group of educated barristers was established. One of the most important moments in English and Welsh law was the creation of the 4 Inns of Court, which were based close to the law courts of Westminster, but outside of the city in the hamlet of Holborn. In the 1450s, a barrister was an apprentice at law, and there were approximately 1,000 of these apprentices within the 4 inns. Today we would call them junior counsellors. Senior counsellors were known as sergeants at law, but there were likely to be less than a handful of those across the inns. The apprentice's working day would begin before it was light, because the courts at Westminster Hall began sitting at 8 AM and only ran for 3 hours. None of the hearings were given a specific time slot because the cases were handed out on a first-come, first-served basis. Having so little time to prepare, a barrister would concentrate on developing his understanding of the law, refining his ability to think quickly in a moment, and react swiftly to any unforeseen legal argument. He needed to safeguard his client's chances at all times. Barristers were well respected during the Middle Ages and founded many of the laws that we still observe today. Membership of one of the inns is still essential, and a student cannot become a barrister until they have joined one of them. Butcher. As with bakers, butchers were regulated by law. The selling of inferior cuts of meat and weight fixing had high penalties. Butchers could be dragged out into the street and covered in manure, forced to drink sour beer and put into the stocks so that the locals could throw rotten food and stones at them. For the poor, pottage, the thick stew made with vegetables and grain, was a staple food. During the Low Middle Ages, meat was only for the wealthy nobles and royalty, but by the later period, the up-and-coming merchant classes had established themselves, and towns attracted more and more specialist sellers. It is a myth that rancid meat was highly spiced to cover up the taste. Meat was a luxury item and quite expensive, but spices were even more so. Bad meat would never be eaten because of the risk of food poisoning, and costly spice would never be wasted on bad meat. Smithfield's Market in London, which was also the site of the execution of Scottish hero William Wallace, became the most celebrated livestock market in England. In the north, at York, the Shambles was a street of butchers' shops, known in the 15th century as the Great Flesh Shambles. Each shop had a wide window bottom to lay out the meat, hooks to hang the carcasses from, and a slaughterhouse in the back of the shop. The buildings were jettied so that the meat was protected from direct sunlight, and a channel ran down the centre of the street so the butchers could dispose of any blood and offal. With its own guild, butchers became quite well respected because of their knowledge of anatomy. But, ironically, many were also seen as slightly dodgy. And given the unsanitary conditions in most medieval towns and cities, it's not really surprising. We can only be thankful for our food safety and hygiene laws today. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Do hope you've learned a thing or two, and be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos, as we do release one every week. Cheers!